Unskillful in the word, proving sola scriptura by contradiction. It is often claimed the Bible does not teach sola scriptura, that Scripture itself does not teach that Scripture is our only authority in faith and morality, and that we're each responsible to interpret Scripture for ourselves. If something as important as sola scriptura is true, one would expect it to be evident in Scripture. Perhaps it is, and we just can't see it. Maybe we're expecting it to be stated in a certain way, unable to perceive it as he's actually stated it. Or it may be that we don't want to see it because we're unwilling to obey it. John 1:17. One way to tackle this is to observe that if any scripture is inconsistent with rejecting sola scriptura, Scripture is effectively stating sola scriptura via proof by contradiction. To recognize the truth in each context, we must carefully think through the implications of the text, or will likely miss its full meaning. Consider the last part of Hebrews 5, where God accuses believers who've been in the faith a while with neglect for being unskilled in interpreting Scripture. Hebrews 5:12 through 14. They are expected to have a reasonably good handle on Scripture by this time, able to use it to parse out difficult moral dilemmas and articulate their faith. If we're not expected to interpret Scripture for ourselves and to interpret it properly, this passage makes no sense. It proves sola scriptura by contradiction. And when Paul exhorts Timothy to be diligent to demonstrate he's approved by God, a laborer in the word who doesn't need to be ashamed, correctly interpreting Scripture, 2 Timothy 2:15, he's telling Timothy to immerse himself in the word, pondering it day by day, comparing Scripture with Scripture until he can demonstrate how all of his personal beliefs are consistent with all of Scripture. Again, if we aren't expected to interpret Scripture for ourselves and accountable to God for how we interpret it, this passage makes no sense, proving sola scriptura by contradiction. And when Paul exhorts Titus to ordain to the office of bishop older men who have a firm grasp of Scripture, who are able to challenge and expose false teachers, Titus 1:9, he's telling us all by example to immerse ourselves in the Word, pondering it day by day, comparing Scripture with Scripture until we can reason properly from Scripture to expose those who are trying to exalt themselves through false teaching. Again, if we aren't expected to interpret Scripture for ourselves and accountable to God for how we do so, this passage makes no sense, proving sola scriptura by contradiction. And when God commends the Ephesian church for exposing false apostles, Revelation 2:2, he presumes we have an infallible authority by which to evaluate and expose deceptive authority figures who would lead us astray, which by definition cannot merely be other men claiming the apostolic role. Disqualifying one claiming to be an apostle of Christ requires showing their message to be inconsistent with the words of Christ. This requires having the written, infallible word and the ability to interpret it correctly. Again, if we aren't expected to interpret Scripture for ourselves and accountable to God for how we do, this passage makes no sense, proving sola scriptura by contradiction. If we are unwilling to shoulder the responsibility of rightly dividing the word, since that takes a lot of investment on our part, a lot of soul searching, much prayerful pondering and digging, if we don't care much about finding the truth for ourselves and owning our personal beliefs before God, thinking we can delegate this to others and that God won't mind too much if we're wrong, we'll be looking for ways to support that mindset and be totally blind to what the word is actually saying. When God tells us to labor to enter into his rest, Hebrews 4:11, to strive to enter the heavenly kingdom, Luke 13:24, to give diligence to make our calling and election sure, 2 Peter 1:10, to search the scriptures to ensure we have eternal salvation, John 5:39, to obediently receive his word into our inmost being, since it's able to save our souls, James 1:21. He's warning us we have no excuse if we neglect his offer of salvation, Hebrews 2:3. If we don't personally seek the Lord until we're absolutely sure we belong to him, Matthew 7:13 and 14. Be not deceived. God is not mocked. For whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. For he that soweth to his flesh shall of the flesh reap corruption. But he that soweth to the Spirit shall of the Spirit reap life everlasting. Galatians 6:7 and 8.